Hi everyone, I'm Tara Mont, and you're listening to the Trust and Thrive with Tara Mont podcast. I created this podcast along with my blog and brand to hopefully inspire others to live their most authentic life. I truly believe that we all have the power to live a life we love, and to do so, it's so important to be in tune with ourselves and be open to growing and evolving. I believe that once we can trust ourselves and our vision, that's when we can thrive. So with this podcast, I plan to discuss all things to do with self-reflection, personal growth, mindsets, and self-belief, all aspects that affect us in our everyday life. If you feel connected to my message and want to listen more often, I will be sharing one podcast a week, so make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Hello everyone, welcome back to this week's episode. So for this week's interview, we're touching on a little bit of a different topic. I feel like I haven't done an episode on career and business in a while. So for this week's episode, we have Steve Kahan. Steve is a serial entrepreneur that has had great success moving from the corporate world early in his career to the startup world. He shares lessons learned in over 30 years for how young professionals or those that feel stuck in the corporate world can earn a great living doing what they love by igniting their career in ideally a technology startup. Steve has successfully helped to grow 6 startup companies from early stage development to going public or being sold, resulting in more than $3 billion in shareholder value. He is currently the CMO at Thycotic, which will become the 7th startup company he's worked for. Steve inspires teams and their organizations to take on the impossible and succeed. He has just written a book published by Wiley and Audible and is available on Amazon.com. The book is called Be a Startup Superstar. We touch on so many topics that really are helpful to any field because we discuss questions that are important to ask in an interview, finding your passion and gaining experience, and so much more. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I was very thankful to Steve's team for reaching out to me. I really did enjoy speaking with him, and I think he has so much knowledge and experience to share that can be really helpful for anyone, and not just college graduates or, people of a certain age. You can be at any point of your life and still be figuring out your career and what you want to do, and I think Steve gives some great insight on what to reflect on. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll get right into it with Steve. Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It is great being with you, Tara. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Can you start off telling us a little more about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I am currently the Chief Marketing Officer at Thycotic, but I am absolutely a serial entrepreneur. I have now been with 7 startups. The previous 6 have either sold or have gone public, generating over $3 billion in shareholder value. And I am author of a new book called Be a Startup Superstar.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you went into the startup space? Did you work corporate before? What inspired you to get into the startup space?
To take a step back, I, like so many other of probably your listeners, my parents used to tell me as I was growing up, and in particular my father, he would say, Steve, get your degree, go to work for a large corporation, you work hard, they'll take care of you, and you'll have a great career. And then he would say, of course, your mother and I would much prefer that you become a doctor or a lawyer. Short of that, getting a job at a large corporation will do. And so that was the path I took. And I got a job at a large corporation, and at about a year and a half in, I remember opening up my bank statement and staring at the pile of claims that I was supposed to process that day. I was down to $50 in my account and was wondering how on earth would I ever get ahead. And I'd work long days, and the student loans would take a hold of my paychecks before they'd ever get a chance to hit my bank account. And so on one day that I was going through that exact situation, I asked myself an important question. And that was, how could I earn a great living and love the work I do? And it was at that point that I decided to make the jump to the startup world. Without questions, I made all the mistakes that certainly I've learned how to correct. But 3.5 years later, after making that jump, where I was the first person hired into marketing, that company went public, and I got the bug and never left the startup world.
And how did you deal with that uncertainty that does come up with the startup space and just anything that's risky? Because I think a lot of people can relate to that story of graduating from college, whether or not they went to school, and just getting a corporate job right away or something more stable in their eyes. So, how are you able to deal with the uncertainty of your path?
Right. So for me, what I really do, and really what I've learned, are what you ought to be looking at to reduce that risk, right? Because there's no question that most startups don't make it. And I may have gotten a little bit lucky at my first startup, but now that I've been with seven, and for example, the company I'm with now, 4.5 years ago, we were 6 million. And this past year, we just closed the year and we're about 100 million. And so I've learned quite a bit how to minimize that risk. And so maybe it might be valuable if I share the criteria that I look for now based on many years and lessons learned to reduce that risk when you join a startup. And so really the first criteria that I look for are quality people who share the same values that I do. And there's no question that people reflect the company culture. And if you don't think you can respect, trust, and admire the people involved, you need to move on to another option. And so really what you're looking for is a management team that will rock your world. So that is the first criteria I look for. The second that I look for is a concept that fills a big market need. And what you learn is that most customers don't spend money on nice to solve problems. They spend money on must solve problems. And what you're looking for is a product certainly that is capable of doing that, but also doing your research. There's so much available by analysts and industry influencers to make sure that the market is big enough and provides sufficient runway for you. And don't be afraid if you see that there's a lot of bigger competitors on there. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Be afraid if you see that there's not many competitors, because it might suggest that there isn't a market. The next thing that I look for is a great product that you can believe in. So if the product or the service is not something that you would purchase or recommend yourself, and that you're highly passionate about, not only just in terms of that product, but also that your role in creating it, if you can't get behind it with enthusiasm, move on. And then finally, that the startup itself is well funded. So naturally, you want to choose a startup that has a long enough runway to get off the ground. And so make sure that it's properly capitalized so you have the best chance for growth and stability. If you ask the right questions that help you to gain positive answers to those criteria, you will dramatically reduce your risk of joining a startup that doesn't make it, and increase the odds that you'll be on to something that will be hugely successful.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought that up because I did want to ask how you see potential in startups, and those are great criteria to look at. And so, overall, what are some misconceptions you've heard about the startup space? Because I think in media and what we see, we imagine like two people, and I mean, that can be the case, it's always different. But overall, are there some misconceptions you often hear about the startup space?
Well, I think one of the big misconceptions, I think, is that if you're at a startup, there's less resources, there's less people, and what that means is that you could get out of balance from a work-life balance perspective in a hurry, and that therefore then you're sort of sacrificing part of your life. And So what I've learned actually is where there's no question that in startups, there are less people. There's just a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. But really, how you manage and kind of protect your calendar such that you can manage to a proper balance. And so maybe if that is the misconception that folks are oftentimes workaholics and can get out of balance, what you could do to minimize that. And let me make a suggestion. So first and foremost, you have got to learn how to become your own top priority. And the best thing that you could do is to take a look at your own calendar, and is the most important item on your calendar you? Are you priority number one? And so I'd like to actually challenge your listeners right now to go open their own calendars and take a look at them right now and check to see over the next couple of weeks how many appointments you have with yourself this week and next. And I'll bet that if you're like most people, you have too few. And think about some of the most valuable uses of your time that then are perhaps going to things that don't support you in the achievement of the objectives that are really important. And for example, what I do is I'll block time for myself for workouts or for family time to make sure that I'm home, that I don't miss kids' games, or I'm home for dinner or for things like that, or maybe even time to learn new things or to focus strategically on items that would be important to helping our business grow. And so what I do is I manage myself oftentimes by my calendar, and I'll book times for myself and make sure that the most important priority on my calendar is actually me. And that has helped me to manage a proper balance. And I would just add one other thing is that I've often seen people kind of get freaked out that they get concerned about, are they spending too much time at home or at work? And there never seems to be the perfect answer. And I would say don't worry about looking for perfection there. And I actually heard a term that I loved called work-life harmony. And what was really suggesting was that there's a sliding scale, and things ebb and flow based upon what is important at that time. And I think that's a healthier way to go about seeking that proper balance. So I think that that's a misconception just in terms of just that you could get out of whack if you go to work at a startup given the work demands. But then also I try to provide a very specific way in which you can proactively manage for it.
That's such a great suggestion and something important to think about too, because I think we often forget that there may be a very different workload, and obviously every company is different, every space is different. But could you just compare your experience in the startup space compared to the corporate world?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I started out in the corporate world and I was processing claims. I mean, how boring, at least for me. And so here's what I've learned about large corporations. I guess what I experienced, and certainly with people that I talk to that work there, is that they tend to be burdened by incumbent mindsets. That oftentimes you're hired into a smaller span of authority, oftentimes what I would call a pigeonhole role, where barriers to advancement could be high. There tends to be more acceptance of the status quo or bureaucracy. And so in many ways, the large corporations are like giant ships. They're harder to maneuver, they're slower to change course. And if you compare that to a startup in many ways is not like a giant ship. It's really like a speedboat that's darting around the giant ship. There tends to be more innovation. They move faster. There's, oftentimes you'll hear things more of a nimble startup mentality. There's a better chance to get into the C-suite without question. I mean, there's 46,000 startups around the United States alone, compare that to, for example, the Fortune 500 and your odds of getting the C-suite in there. There's no question that there are risks. There's lots of change, but if you're entrepreneurial, it's absolutely, the startup world is a place where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. And so, how can one tell if they are entrepreneurial and they have those qualities? What qualities would you say help you thrive in the startup space? Because some people may thrive more in the corporate world or doing something else. So, what would you say are some skills and qualities that are important to have?
Okay, so first of all, startups that your listeners should know that they are desperate for hiring, right? And so they're hiring across all functional areas. And so if you kind of uh, then focus, what are the qualities that make you a standout candidate at a startup? It's really as follows. I think first, it's people who embrace accountability to get things done. Within a startup, you can't hide, right? You're on the front lines, you're in the trenches, and so you have to be someone who wants to be accountable. I think secondly, it's people who communicate in thoughtful, smart, confident, and respectful ways. And really, not only people who are communicating, but also those who tend to ask maybe as many questions as they do proactively communicate. Certainly that catches my eye. Another is someone who is not an I person. And by an I person, I mean that these are the people that tend to take credit for virtually everything, as opposed to someone who is a we person. And a we person is someone who's team oriented, someone who tends to share the credit. You're working with a small team, and sort of having that we mentality is really important. Without question, someone who's willing to work hard because there's no easy button. You need to pay attention to the details at a startup for sure, because the difference between an A result or a B plus result is always in the details. And then finally, I think someone who has persistence and tenacity. In startups, you are against better funded competitors all the time, and you are going to run into obstacles. And so you want to be someone who is not going to turn a small obstacle into a major mountain, or and to be someone who has the tenacity to stick through with things, because that's really what's required to make it through the thin, to see the great results of hard work from your team. So for me, those are very much of those attributes that make you perfect for a startup.
So, now going into, I know you just talked about the skills that are important to have, but would you say that also with the startup space, patience is important? Patience, whether it is with the specific company or just trying out multiple different startups and realizing that it won't always grow right away?
I think that patience is important. I mean, you'll find a lot of impatient people in the startup world, and it will certainly help you stick out. I think that it's a combination of, I would almost say, sense of urgency with patience. And it might seem like those two attributes are at odds with one another, but they're really not. It's having a sense of urgency to work on the most important items that will support the most important objectives for the company. But then, of course, having the patience to stick with some of the plans that you put in place to actually give them a chance to work. It's a fine line, a delicate balance, but it's really, I think, a combination of both of those that really help you to succeed at the highest level.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that networking is really important when it comes to the startup space? Or I'm just curious as to how you were able to get into it and how you heard about it in the first place.
So I think that there are a couple of ways that I would offer up that could be networking that might be very valuable to your listeners. And so let me mention two of them. So in virtually every major city, there is what's known as an accelerator. So in the case of the technology world, they're known as technology accelerators. And these tend to be application only programs that provide capital, mentorship, and educational opportunities. And they, for funding startups in that particular city. And those startups underneath those technology accelerators are constantly putting on different events. They are directly recruiting for jobs right from those accelerator websites that you could find right by doing a Google search, accelerator within your particular city. And they provide a great way for you to quickly search some of those great networking opportunities that you might not have otherwise known about. I think another way then to network, which is kind of overlooked and not used enough, is engaging with startup leaders online. And I've had people do this with me. So, for example, if you find people and companies that you're interested in, follow those people online and social media. Read their posts, and when you see something interesting or have some questions, reach out. Right. So I've had people reach out to me, for example, where they want to get career advice or they want to network, and they've done so via socials such as LinkedIn Messenger. And if you do this, don't be dissuaded if not every startup executive reaches back out to you. These are busy people. But what you'll find is many of these executives, they realize that there are people that help them in their career along the way, and they want to pay it forward. And so if you connect with those people and you're able to do so, not in a salesy way, but in a sincere, heartfelt way, perhaps you're interested in learning how to grow your career or achieve a similar career path as the person that you're reaching out to, and you've got some good, thoughtful questions, then it naturally gives you the opportunity to transition that conversation to you, where you might be able to gain access to the network of that executive. Oftentimes, jobs are directly found that way, right at that company or within that executive's network. And so a lot of folks don't actually do that and directly reach out to those that can help them. And just with a little bit of research and a little bit of proactive outreach, you'd be surprised how many will respond to you and then ultimately where that will take you. Worst case is you might actually gain a new mentor that might help you in your career in a big way.
Definitely. And now, too, it's so easy with LinkedIn and other ways to just message people right away. And so I know we talked about networking, but when it comes to choosing maybe what role you want to apply for or what area you want to be in, what department you want to work in, for someone who has no idea what they want to do, what would you recommend? Would you recommend just, starting in different roles and trying them out? What tips would you give?
Well, I think obviously, some folks have an affinity, or perhaps they've graduated college with an emphasis in a particular area. I mean, I will just sort of share how I found my passion, which is marketing, which is basically I did not go to college for marketing. I got into my first startup and was kind of an entry level marketer and was willing to do everything. And this company just needed someone to get some things done, right? And there's lots of those. And so I was very persistent and I guess persuasive enough to make my way into my first opportunity. And I wasn't so concerned about really the trying to earn a huge amount of money. I realized, at least at that time, that I just didn't have the experience. But here's what I did. I was like a sponge. I every book I could get my hands onto, every seminar that I could attend, every person that I might want to meet that perhaps I read about that was getting results that I wanted to get, I tried to network with. And I did everything, right? Because I was the only one, at least for me, in marketing at that time. And what that did was it gave me the opportunity to really build deep expertise early on, because that's what the world pays for. And so, ultimately, what I would say is I was really passionate about marketing. I really loved it. I will have to admit, I really didn't know all what it involved at that time. But it was something that I was very passionate in, and I just made it a lifelong set of learning. And what I've also learned is that when I made the move into marketing, the world of marketing has changed so much from that point and continues to change at a very rapid pace. And so to stay on top of your game, you've got to make the commitment to constant learning such that you're able to stay one step ahead of the competition. But if you love learning and you're really dedicated to becoming the best at what you do, I think startups offer a great opportunity for you to sort of have versatility in your role and gain lots of different experiences just because they're not small spans of authority. And it really gives you an opportunity to learn, grow, try things out, fail a little bit, learn from that, and then move your career forward.
Mm-hmm. Definitely being a sponge is so vital, and it's very common, I think, for people to enter the workspace after college, especially, or when they're younger, thinking that they have to prove so much and that they can't ask questions or they have to know everything, when in reality, that's when you're learning most and you need to just be that sponge and take it all in. And so I know you said it's great to stick to one area and grow in that way, but for someone who may want to change their career path, but they maybe feel like it's too late or they know so much about something else already, what advice would you give to them?
Well, I will tell folks who are in that sort of situation this is that I think in terms of if you've spent the majority of your life in no matter how long that's been your work life in a large corporation, I think that considering a startup would be very smart, and here's why. So when you think of investments, right, we all make different investments. We might invest for perhaps in the stock market, right? And so, and you might research companies and you really don't get a chance to know the CEO, or you really don't know that company in spite of how much research that you do. But if you're fortunate enough to get stock options in a startup that you join, that's so important. And the reason for that is that as you get older, a funny thing happens. If you're successful in your career, you're making more money, and that's great. But then your expenses go up, right? And so as you're making more money, then you get married, and then you buy a house, and then you're buying cars, and then you have kids, right? And it's really hard to get ahead, even for the most diligent of investor. And so what I've always viewed, and the way in which I've tried to create separation from myself, how I would advise others, is that if you're able to get into a startup and choose the right one by perhaps putting into action some of the criteria that we briefly spoke about earlier, and that you bet on yourself and bet on the team that you're working for, that if the company grows and you're able to have a good outcome, that those stock options can become very valuable and can help create separation for you financially and put you on a path that just is at the next level trajectory. And so there's more certainly to work life than the financial side, without question. But to me, when I talk to those who maybe are a little bit later in their career, or they feel it's too late to join a startup, I advise them to consider betting on themselves, gaining the opportunity to get into a company where they can get stock options, choosing the right one, and betting on themselves and their team, because what I found is it's the best financial bet I've certainly ever made. And it's one that you have a little bit more control over.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that someone who may not have the entrepreneurial qualities and maybe they feel more comfortable in the corporate world, but they want to try the startup space, do you think they can thrive there too? Or do you think the qualities to be really successful in the startup space have to do with kind of having a lot more on your plate?
Well, I think it depends. Like if you're someone, and it's not bad, right? If you're someone that wants to work 9 to 5, each day and kind of have it very predictable. You come in, you do your thing, right? Or you're used to having like a ton of available resources where other people do different things. There are, for example, building a career at a large corporation could be a very, very fulfilling career without question. But I just have seen too many positive experiences. Great example of this is that when I joined a cybersecurity startup many, many years ago, and we built a plan early on that we rolled out in the first 90 days. And my team and I built this plan. It was a small team. And that plan set the company on a much more successful course. And when we rolled it out after the first 90 days to the company, you could see people light up in the room. It was like they saw a new vision. They saw how we were going to be successful. And it was a company where not one single day felt like work. And we had a really successful outcome 5 years later. But here is what to me is maybe the most important part of that story is now it's like 18 years later, and that company, of which it grew to about 350 before it ultimately exited, we still get together at annual reunion parties in Houston, Texas, and literally 70+% of the company attends these annual reunion parties every single year. And all we could do is reminisce how awesome it was to be part of something so special. We created bonds that will last the rest of our lives. It's situations like that you probably don't hear work, maybe processing claims at Geico, right? And so, but that was the type of experience that I had the blessing of being a part of, and really sort of how this team still stays so close for many, many years and will the rest of our lives.
That's amazing. And I think that's another example of really trusting the process and, seeing it as a marathon, because even though that was a reunion, but just being in the startup space too, and any workspace, you kind of have to trust that, take years and years to get to where you want to be, and trust that it's not something that happens right away. And I think a lot of people right after school and when they're at a young age, they just want that validation, and they want that really cool career right away when it takes that time. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts on even just the interview process and getting there, because there's so many jobs right now, but there's also so many people wanting jobs, and it can be really hard to stand out. So what advice would you give to someone who wants to stand out, to recruiters and to get a job that they want?
Okay, so I covered some of the criteria of selecting a good startup. Now, this is the time for people to take out their pens and paper, because I'm going to give you the questions that I would ask that not only will you stand out and differentiate yourself by asking these questions big time, but you will also be able to gain information to help you judge whether it's the right startup. So let me go through those questions. So the first, why is now the time for your company to exist? Another one, what milestones has the company achieved? Another, what do you love about your team, and why are you the ones to solve this problem? Another, tell me a little bit about a paying customer and what that experience was like for that customer to become part of the family that you would be joining. And then what are the revenue expectations over the next year? Another, how much has the company raised and what is its runway? I'll give you two more. Who are your investors and why did you choose them? And then here's one I mentioned, sort of sharing and values. This is the question that I asked for that. If you weren't building your startup, what would you be doing? If you ask those questions, you will differentiate yourself big time, but also you will learn so much about the company that you are considering joining that it will help you make the best decision possible.
That's so important. And going into interviews, a lot of people think that they just have to give all their information and talk about themselves. But we all have the right to know where we might be working and if we fit and if that relationship works. And so when it comes to, for example, even just mentors and learning more about their experience, how do you recommend finding someone who can possibly be a mentor, and how helpful do you think that is?
Well, mentors are critical. And I mean, now I mentor many people, but I have my own mentors. And by the way, your mentors will change over the years, right? And so you might have some mentors, but mentors that support you at one phase of your life or your career will not be the same mentors that will support you elsewhere. So for me, I've often found that the best mentors that I have gained access to are really, one, either people that I've come into contact with that have achieved much of the type of success that I want to be able to achieve. And typically, these are people that I've had the opportunity to build a relationship with. And so I like finding mentors based on those that I tend to know, because then they know me. I feel more comfortable letting my hair down and really allowing for that good two-way communication to occur. But then also through some of that direct contact that I had mentioned, that researching some of those leaders or potential mentors that you might want to talk with, and I think directly reaching out to them and seeing if actually that there is a good basis or the sort of chemistry between yourself and that person that you might want to mentor, to see if they are willing to actually help you, or if you're willing to accept the advice that sometimes that they might be giving, or tough love as well. Right. And so, for me, a great example of this, there's a CEO that I used to work for early in my career, an extremely successful person that I've stayed in contact to this day, that I consider him now more of a friend-ter, a combination of a mentor and a friend. And if I've got a big decision that I'm going to make, there's no question that he would be amongst the people that I would contact, because he's achieved such great success personally, professionally, and financially. And so I look for people who are way have surpassed anywhere where I am, and I not only will look for those people for mentors, but I also just want to go into one other thing, and that is, it's also, you are sort of very much judged by a little bit of the company that you keep. And so one of the things that I also do is I really try to define the A-plus talent that I want to surround myself that help to bring out the best in me. So, for example, if you are listening to this and you're joining a startup, or you're working at a company, I like personally to define the type of people that have some of the skills and experience that I need around myself, and to see if those people actually exist, right? No one can be an A-plus talent at everything. And so sometimes surrounding yourself with people who maybe fill in some of the gaps or areas that are missing or things that you can learn from, I found is also so important. So it's not just the mentors, it's also literally defining the type of people you want to surround yourself with, I think is also and oftentimes equally as important.
And I think that a lot of that comes down to values and also knowing what kind of company you want to work for and what you're passionate about. So, would you also recommend like conventions, workshops, maybe masterminds, like group settings? Is that something you've done?
I do. I found that at least for me personally, I've got to build a little bit of a personal relationship with those that have been my mentors, right? And so for me, I find that those might be places where you might find people that eventually someday, based on the relationship that you build, could be places for sure. But as I mentioned, for me, I've proactively looked for some of the type of people that have experienced just amazing success and have really looked to those people that I've tried to build relationships with because they help me, one, to understand how much I actually don't know, but then also they're capable of helping me to get to not make small incremental jumps, but major leaps forward based on the span of the mentor relationship that we would have.
And I think that relates to anyone, whether that is startup culture, corporate world, or someone's into music or they have their own business. So that's definitely important to have. And so I want to ask you finally, I know you gave a lot of advice to college graduates and young professionals, but if you could give your final thoughts and advice to young professionals who are just now starting in the professional world, what would you tell them?
So I would tell them as really what as follows. So first and foremost, I would say you have much of what you need in order to achieve the success you want, and that today's startups have big ideas and are well funded, and they're desperate to hire smart, motivated, hardworking people to share their talents in innovative workspaces that are buzzing with energy and opportunity. And they're hiring for all kinds of people. They're hiring artsy people, techie people, young, old, experienced, green, those who work in the office or remote. So if you want to earn a great living doing what you love for the right startup, you could be a godsend.
And it's definitely finding your talents and what you're great at. And so, with that said, this whole show is about living your most authentic life. And that has to do with every aspect of life, including professionally and finding what you're passionate about and what your strengths are. And so, I want to ask you now, what does living your most authentic life mean to you?
I think it's being true to yourself, right? And so we all know when you kind of look yourself in the mirror and you search your soul, where true north is for you, what truly makes you passionate, um, how important it is to then so be with people and teams and your family and be doing things that uh, have you get up in the morning with a smile on your face, ready just to rock and roll. And so for me, what I think about my most authentic life is that I do some of my very best thinking when I am just getting up in the morning, where it's totally peaceful, it's totally quiet, where I could just almost think about what is critically important in my life, and whether that's personally, professionally, whatever that might be, and then how I'm going to go achieve those things. And I think if you really sort of search your inner soul at those most quiet times, it really is what I found where I've made some huge discoveries and some huge leaps forward, and have come up with some of my very best ideas that have enabled those big leaps to occur. And so if you don't spend the quiet time really getting away from social media, or your phone, or just having the opportunity to just sit and think about yourself and your future and your objectives and how you're going to make it happen, that is where sort of that crossroads of authenticity lies. And I think it's where you'll make the biggest positive impact for yourself.
What can listeners expect to take away from your book? Can you give us a little more in depth on what people can expect?
Sure. So be a startup superstar. First of all, I do want to say it's available wherever books are sold online, for example, at Amazon. But the book essentially really covers as follows. It talks about why you might want to consider going to work in the startup world, how you would select a good startup versus one that perhaps is not so good. And then once you've made the decision to join a startup, under what I call 7 keys to the C-suite, I've identified 35 actions, attitudes, and behaviors one must have to maximize success at a startup. And so it's a quick read. It's very much written in a how-to type format, and it's illustrated with stories out of my own experience or the experiences out of some very successful startup entrepreneurs. And so please read it. And if you go to my website at beastartupsuperstar.com, and if you have any questions, I respond to every one of them personally. I'd love to hear from you if you choose to read the book.
Amazing. Well, I was going to ask you where they can find it, so that's perfect. So lastly, do you have any more info about what's coming up next for you in your work that you would like to share with listeners?
Well, for me, in my work, it's really continuing to help grow Thycotic, which is a cybersecurity company. We've achieved massive growth over the last 4.5 years, and that trajectory should continue. But it's also about paying it forward. It's why I wrote the book, is to help grow the next generation of leaders. And so for me, that's very important. So that will be a big focus of my life, as will continuing to paddleboard, spending lots of time with my grandchildren, and hopefully getting my pilot's license soon.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story. I really appreciate it, and I know listeners will too. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode with Steve. There were so many great takeaways. He clearly has a lot of experience that he was able to share. It can be so intimidating whether you are graduating from school or you're just now starting to get in the professional world. There's so much pressure to find what you love and to get a job right away or to find your passion, when in reality, it's such a long process. We're always discovering new passions. We're always discovering new skills we have and learning new skills. And we're going to be rejected from jobs. We're going to be disappointed. And that's part of the experience. So I was really interested to hear Steve's story because, I hear a lot about the startup space and how great it is to start a startup, but there are also many misconceptions and, there are pros and cons to both the startup space, the corporate world, and also, having your own business. So it really just depends on what you want to do. This episode isn't to push anyone to, work in startup or to follow Steve's path. Obviously, everyone's different. We all have different skills, backgrounds, passions, different paths we want to take. So trust yourself, trust that you know where you're going. But I think a huge takeaway from this episode is to really put yourself out there and take those risks and just be a sponge. I love how he said that when you first start somewhere, and if you don't know what you want to do, especially, just be a sponge. Take in all the information you can take in and learn as much as you can. You know, you have to gain that experience, and everyone has to start somewhere. So that's something I've been dealing with too, because I've been in and out of the corporate world, and I've also just been reflecting on what path I want to take, and if I want to work at a startup or corporate or do my own thing. And there's so many options. I think it's all about just really trying new things and realizing that it's okay if you work at a job or you work at a startup right away and it's not where you want to be, or vice versa. You might love it and you might stay there for a few years or a long time. So just keep trying, keep reaching out to people, keep networking. That's something I'm also working on. There's so many ways to connect with people and just ask questions. You just have to put yourself out there and be okay with that failure and confusion. I'm also on the path of discovering new options that I maybe didn't even realize were ideal options. And so, like Steve said, I'm sure if you want to reach out to him and ask more questions, I'm sure he would be really open to answering them. So if you would like to read his book, you can find it on Amazon. So I will make sure to include all his info in the description of this episode. So his website is beastartupsuperstar.com, and you can also find him on LinkedIn. Just visit the description of the episode. So you can find me on the Instagram for this podcast at trustandthrive, or my personal Instagram at tar.mont. And all those links will also be in the description of the episode. Once again, I hope this episode has been helpful. Please let me know. Please feel free to leave a rating or review. It would mean the absolute world. The reviews are so helpful on Apple iTunes. I want you to be able to take away some really helpful information, and that's all I want. I really hope I've been able to resonate with these interviews. Please let me know what you've been enjoying. And if you do, thank you in advance for your feedback. It's very helpful and I appreciate it. So have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will catch you all next Thrive Thursday.